Before I hand things over to Reverend Miller, I just wanted to say a few words. And that is, first and foremost, we were all horrified when we saw the video now a week or two ago of George Floyd's murder. And it's incomprehensible to think of how someone could commit an act like that, and equally incomprehensible that three police officers could stand by and do nothing. And one of the great thinkers and leaders of Orthodox Judaism in 20th century America was Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, Rav Soloveitchik's brother. And Rav Aaron wrote an essay in the midst of the civil rights era where he talked about the two obligations that all Jews have. One is about v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that you should love your fellow as yourself, which according to Chazal, according to the Talmud, is actually really about an obligation to other Jews, to those who you're kin with, that you have to care for them, be passionate about their issues. And this is something that I think, especially in the Orthodox community, thank God we do a very good job at. We care for each other, we care for Israel, we stand up against anti-Semitism, but certainly the second obligation, which is just as important, he says, is about kavod habriot, respecting everyone, ensuring everyone is respected in society, that everyone can live in a dignified and secure manner. And that Chazal tell us, that principle is derived from the fact that the Torah tells us we are all created, B'Tselem Elokim, we are all created in God's image. And Rav Aaron Soloveitchik points out that all of the laws of Mishpat and Tzedek derive from this principle, really, of kavod habriot. Mishpat is fundamentally about rights, human rights, which are, of course, enshrined also in American law. But tzedek is about something else. Tzedek, he says, is unique to a religious law as opposed to secular law. Because tzedek is really about not just our rights, but about an obligation to make the world a better place. And that we right now very much have to focus on this principle of kavod habriot and think about how we as a community can make sure we are living up to it and carrying it out. I think there are a few different ways in which we do that. First and foremost, of course, on an abstract level, right? We're not just, everyone is entitled to rights, but we are not just abstractions. Everyone, of course, all lives matter, but we know from our own experience that at particular moments, when we as a community are in pain, when we as a community are attacked, it's so important to us to hear other people call out anti-Semitism. And we are now in a moment where we have an opportunity to do that for another community, to do that especially to show solidarity with the African-American community, to say that now is the time we are going to stand up for Black lives, because they are a community that is in pain, and part of how we show respect for people is by recognizing the unique pain that they feel and understanding the unique challenges that they face. But in order to get there, in order to understand what another community is going through, we have to listen. One of Rav Kook's major students and colleagues argued that the whole notion of how one learns something, according to Judaism, the highest way of learning something is through listening. That if we just use our logic or we just use our eyes, oftentimes we find what we want to find. We see what we want to see. But it is when we listen, when we close our eyes even and listen, that then we're really open to what's going on around us. And because of that, I am really grateful that Reverend Miller has agreed to speak to us tonight, to share the experiences of his community and his perspective, and what he would like us to understand about the situation today, how we got here, and where we need to go as a community and as a society in order to heal the fractures that we see. So I'm going to hand things over to Reverend Miller in a moment. I'm just going to read a little bit of his biography. Reverend Miller is very accomplished. He's currently, so that his biography is quite long. So I'm not going to include everything. I hope that's all right. But Reverend Miller is currently the pastor of Rust and Wesley United Methodist Churches. They are two historic African-American churches in Lorain County. As Reverend Miller mentioned before, one of them is in Oberlin. He's also the principal of SRM Group, a consulting business that's focused on building and maintaining effective relationships with customers, employees, and community and public officials, and is especially focused around issues of diversity. And he previously was the executive director of the Cleveland chapter of the NAACP. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, Reverend Miller. If I can find you, I'm going to unmute you now.
Did that do it?
That did it.
Okay, good. Well, good evening and thank you everyone. And that was a great introduction. I love it to death. And I'll reiterate something I said earlier. This technology that we're using today has blessings to it, because we are going to continue going forward to use this medium in our churches so we can share it with members of our church that can't get in the building. And that's just something important. I like to begin by saying that I pray that everyone is staying safe, and I pray that everyone is dealing with the trauma and issues associated with the time that we're living in, because the times are difficult. And Rabbi Levitt will probably agree with me that the role of a pastor in a time like this is even more difficult. This afternoon, I visited with a lady who was just put in a hospice at 95 years old. And those are people that we really have to care for. And in the job that we have, we deal with the medical issues with the virus, but now we deal with the issues of a shooting and protests and people claiming that the world is falling apart around them. I'll be honest with you. When Gregory Floyd's death showed up on the TV, it bothered me tremendously. And it continued to show up day after day, and they kept showing the video. The saddest part of the events of the past couple of weeks has been the vandalism, the looting, and the things that happen in our communities that just can't stand for. Those things are wrong. But the greatest thing that gave me pause was the fact that a 75-year-old man was pushed down and people walked by him as he died. I mean, could have died in that spot. But I will tell you, I believe that God is working on something new. And I'm not going to preach, but I think he's working on something new. I didn't get a special call from anyone, but I believe that when I saw the number of people that were protesting, when I saw the ages of the people that were protesting, and more importantly, when I saw the races of the people that were protesting, I really believe that something is happening. Something is happening that's going to be good for all of us. I've been involved with protests and marches going back to the Huff riots and the Glenville riots of the 60s. And all those protests and events that took place, all the people were protesting looked like me. But the mix of people that I've been seeing tells me that the stereotypes, the old stereotypes that we've been dealing with, may be on their way out. When I was down at the Cleveland March, I saw this, the mix, but I didn't believe it. And until the national commentators brought it back up as an issue, I really started to believe that something different was going to happen. And then when it started to occur in Europe and Australia and all over, I really said that something is going on. I don't know if you guys caught this or not, but there were some Amish people involved in some of the marches. And that just kind of, took me for a loop to really say that we're going in the right place. The mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. There's no reference to color, no reference to age, and there's no reference to gender. Our goal is to bring people together, just like you had indicated, not to separate people. It gives us an opportunity to go to work on the issues, the real issues that affect us, the ones that impact us and the faith community specifically. Hate, and you've talked about that, bigotry and race issues have been with us, seems like forever. And at least most of my life, I've experienced it. But as it's indicated, I haven't always been a pastor. I grew up in Glenville. For those of you that know the community of Glenville, I know that at least one person on here knows that it was, at the time, back in the 50s and 60s, a middle-class Black community on the east side of Cleveland. And I used to say to myself, why do all these big buildings, these big stately buildings, they were churches, have all the foreign symbols and language that I couldn't understand? I learned later that Glenville had been a major Jewish community in Cleveland. And the church buildings that I'm now hold Episcopal and Baptist and all types of religions were one time Jewish synagogues and temples. But all of those individuals grew up in that area and left and moved into what is now Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights and those types of communities. So to make a long story short, I grew up in a Black community, attended a Black high school, Glenville, and got great shock when I was accepted to Kent State University to play in their marching band. Kent was not very diverse in those days, and I was in a marching band of probably 100 people, and there were 3 people of color in the band. That's how I grew up. The dorm that I stayed in, we were in a suite, and it was me and 3 other men. All of them were white. And I got to tell you, though, we hung together, and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Before that time, I had never spent any time with people other than people of my color. So it was something very special to me, and we were able to bond during those years. I will be honest, though, that I've been blessed to have had a great corporate career. It wasn't mentioned, but I retired as the Vice President of External Affairs for Ohio Bell Ameritech, which ended up being AT&T. And it was a great job, and I enjoyed it. I've served on a number of community boards and commissions, including the board of Tri-C and the president of Cleveland, Warrensville Heights Board of Education, and now I'm the chair of the board of the East Cleveland schools that have been taken over by the state. So I've done a lot of things in my life, and I think I've been helped by a lot of people that didn't look like me to give me those opportunities to move ahead. But my 6 years at the NAACP were the real eye-opener for me. I learned about walking while Black, driving while Black, shopping while Black, and just living while Black. I learned to look at communities based on who lives there, not what the benefit of the community was. I learned about the incarceration rate of people that look like me compared to other populations, and the number of education opportunities that didn't exist at the high school that I attended just because of where I lived in those days. At the NAACP, I gave talks all the time on what my son understand as what we call the talk. The talk was every Black father sat down with his sons and told them what to do when you get stopped by police. What do you do with your hands? What do you say? Don't motion, don't move, don't reach, because they will kill you. That's what I learned growing up, and that's what my boys learned growing up. We had these cards at the NAACP, these green cards, they called them bus cards. What do you do if you get stopped by police? I don't know the number of cards that I've passed out over the course of my time at the NAACP, and I still do it today. And the number of seminars that I've worked with police officers in explaining what do you do if you get stopped by police. I dare say that most of the kids in Beechwood or Solon or maybe down in Powell don't have the same need to have those kind of discussions with your boys. But I did, and I made sure it happened for all the kids that I knew. I worked for a company, the phone company, for 30 years, started out in the mailroom and ended up a vice president. As I said before, I got a lot of help from a lot of people, and I bless them this day. But during the course of that career, there were places where I couldn't go even to inspect the work of my technicians. There were places in Greater Cleveland where installers couldn't even go to install phones if they weren't the right color. That's real. I'm talking about in the 70s. I was the first Black foreman promoted to a city called Euclid, so east side of Cleveland. And three installers quit the company. This was back in 1968, 68, because they wouldn't work for an N-word. So they left their job so they wouldn't have to work for me. Tell you another story. I was turned away from a major development in Cleveland. It was a high-rise apartment, Stuart. It was on 90 and Richmond Road. And I had 12 installers in there installing phones. And I pulled up to the guard station in a company car. In those days, foremen wore shirts and ties. I was the boss. And the guy came out and said, "What do you want? What do you want?" I said, "I'm with the phone company. I'm here to inspect the work of my technicians that I have in there." His comment was, "They don't need you. They don't need you." So I turned my car around, pulled out the driveway, went up and parked. We had phones in the cars even back in those days. And I called my dispatcher, who immediately called a manager, who immediately called the district manager, and went right up the pole of the company. And apparently someone very high at Ohio Bell called the builder of the apartment and said that if you don't let that foreman in, I'm pulling all the men off that job. That's what happened back in those days. And that's important that we remember that a lot of people don't experience those opportunities. When George Floyd was killed, I had the moment myself of wondering what if for my boys. And they're adults now. One is 44 and one is 49, and one is a teacher. And he came by the house on his way to the dentist, and he said, "Dad, how you doing? I'm going to take my daughter to the dentist." And I said to myself, what if? What if the wrong cop for the wrong reason pulls him over? My other son lives in Florida. He's a corporate senior vice president. His wife's a magistrate in the state court. And my grandson is a brown Puerto Rican kid. I asked the same question. What if, when he takes his son up to the field to hit a few balls at the baseball diamond? What if? What if? I just beg the question that the experience that I have had and the experience that my boys have had, I don't think any of your families have had a need to even think about those types of issues. You've never had to do that one what if moment. One if moment. I'll tell you just one story and I get off of it. My son, who's a Wharton grad, this is the one who lives in Florida, about 3 years ago, him and three of his buddies, all Wharton grads, CPAs, one's an attorney, whatever, they were in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, for a class reunion. And he called me up and he said, "Dad, I've never been so hurt in my life." I said, "Stephen, what happened?" He said, "The police pulled us over." I said, "What did you do?" He said, "Nothing." And he said they had us all on the sides of the car with our hands on the car. Wharton grad, Duke MBA, 2 CPAs, and an attorney. Hadn't done anything. Wrong place, the wrong time. That's the risk that you run by just being of a certain color. I think there's a huge divide in just understanding the things that I talked about. Well-meaning people just don't understand, and well-meaning people don't know what other people that don't look like them have to go through. I was introduced to a book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. She spoke at Cleveland State University. I had the chance to be there and I bought the book. It's an excellent read. It talks about race, and it talks about what different people know and understand about race and how different parts of the world deal with it differently. We talked about issues of people just commenting that I'm not a racist. I have Black friends. Those are types of comments that people make, but they don't do the deep dive in understanding what it's all about. I was also blessed to read a book by Jennifer Eberhardt, and it's a book that talks about how we deal with issues of people. And I guess when you think about it, it's called bias. We don't even know what the things that are happening around us even means. There was a program on CPN today, and they were talking about Black families and white families, and how do you talk about race? They said less than 10% of white families have the race discussion with their children. Less than 10%. So what do you mean about a race discussion? Well, just talk about race, the difference between cultures and those kind of things. They don't talk. Somebody asked the question of the commentator, why don't they? Sometimes they don't know what to say. Sometimes they don't understand. And sometimes they're just too embarrassed to talk about it. They talk about the fact that one kid was saying that my parents don't have any Black friends. Well, how do you know? They work for a company, they work with Black people. You guys go out eating restaurants and there's Black people there. He said, but we've never had them over our house. They don't live in our neighborhood. So that's a huge disconnect that we have to deal with. Because this is a religious setting, I want to go into something that is tough, but I got to say it. 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is always seen as the most segregated hour of the week. I know you guys are a different religion, but in the Baptist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, you name it, on the Christian side, that's the truth. That's the truth. In Oberlin, you just mentioned, I have two churches, one in Oberlin and one in Lorraine. In Oberlin, there's two United Methodist churches. There's my church, Rust, 150 years old, and there's First United Methodist Church, about 153 years old, not much older. One is all white and one is all Black in 2020. And they've been around 150 plus years. I guess I asked the question, why? I also asked myself a question that from a theological standpoint, I've gotten a lot of answers because I've talked to bishops and those kind of things. I asked, is the church, is the faith community a victim of the separation of people, or is it a major reason for the separation of people? Is it a victim, or is it a cause or the major reason of the separation? I've gotten so many different answers because nobody wants to talk about it. Some of the books that I've been reading over the last probably year deal with the fact of religion, and they talk about how it's changed over the centuries. And more importantly, the people in the books change over centuries, and people don't understand it. My son was joking me with one day, and I was doing something, and he said, Christmas time, we were talking about Jesus being born in the cradle, and his mom was there, his dad was there, and the wise men were there. You guys may have heard this story. And the angel came and told Joseph, the dad, that the king is going to kill all the babies that were born. So you need to take this baby Jesus and take him to Egypt. And my son asked me the question. He said, Dad, how is a blue-eyed, white, blonde baby with a white mom and a white daddy going to hide in Egypt? That was his question. Maybe a little bit facetious, but it begs the question, what did the world look like then, and where did the people live back then? Has the Bible changed, and is the Bible setting some of the issues and problems that we deal with today? There's a book out by a guy named Williams. It's called The Destruction of Black Civilization, and it talks about the issue that I just placed on the table on how the Bible, through the Romans and all those kind of things, changed who was involved in making decisions. It changed. And then the thing that struck me more than anything else when I talk about the Bible is my grandson, the one that lives in Florida, he's 11. My son was showing him a series of YouTube programs. The one was on Emmett Till. So my son called me up, and because I worked at NAACP, he wanted me to add some context on the story that the YouTube program had just shown. So when Dick called me up and said, "Granddad, this is what I want to talk to you about." And he said, "The first thing I want to ask you is that, why did they put all that makeup on Emmett Till in the coffin?" I said, "Nick, what makeup?" And then he texted me the picture because he had screenshot it and sent it to me. And I said, "No, Nick, that's what they did to him. They beat him up and threw him in the water, and he stayed there, and that's how his face looked." And I said, after that, his mom, Emmett Till's mother, demanded that they have an open coffin, and also demanded that the Jet magazine publish that, just so the world could understand, just so the world could see and learn what was going on at that point in time. Those are the things that are important that kids don't learn. Now, the kid that I just talked about goes to a private school in Florida. He goes to a school that's not very diverse, so I know they don't talk about that kind of history there. And I asked the question the other way, that the white kids that go to school with him, they're not getting the history either. So how do we bring young people along to understand these kind of issues that are happening in our society? I asked, what role does the church play? History is important, and the early church and the early teachings have changed. And I think we as men and women of the church have to step to our role and help tell the story the way it is. I like to think about the racial mix of churches and the racial mix of churches in all the communities. And I think it's important that we understand that that mix is important to the kids. Everybody wants to talk about children, but everything we see and say and do as adults, those children see it and they emulate it. The example I used today in a meeting that I was in with other pastors is that, think of a 2-year-old boy. He goes to church. He goes to a Christian church. So he looks at the Bible, he looks at all the written material and all the pictures, and the person in those pictures all look like him. He's a little white kid. Then he looks at the stained glass window. He looks up behind the altar, and there's a big picture of Jesus with flowing hair that looks like him. So now he goes to school. He's in the 3rd grade, and they talk about who runs the country. And he says, well, I know that at least in the church, that the people that look like me run it. Then he moves on and he becomes a high school student, and it gets a little more difficult, but he still has that in his mind of who makes all the decisions. He ends up going into college, and he knows who makes the decision because he learned it when he was 2 years old. He ends up getting a corporate job, and now he's a boss. And he said, I'm entitled to this job because way back when I was 2 years old, I learned that the Bible is on my side and everything we're doing is for the right. That's what's happening in our world that we have to deal with. There's a church in Oberlin. It's called First United Church of Christ. It's not the United Methodist Church. It's the oldest church in the city. They had a program on white privilege. And the pastor, who's a great guy, did it because of just what I talked about. He wanted people to understand what was happening to people that didn't look like him. And his church is predominantly white. So they ran the series, and the series looked at health, education, jobs, housing, incarceration, those kind of issues, and the issue of white privilege. There was a lady that had to be 80 years old, because I went because my church is a neighbor to his, and we're friends. Lady about 80 years old at the table with me when they were doing the segment on health was just sitting there bawling. She was crying. And I asked her, what's wrong? They were doing a segment on health, and they were talking about the Tuskegee experiments. The lady said, I'm 82 years old, and I've never heard that story. So I couldn't get angry with her. I couldn't criticize her, because that lady just told me that all the time that she grew up, nobody ever talked to her about those kind of issues. But also told me there's a whole lot of other issues, a lot of history that she never learned in those 82 years that she lived. So it boils down to, again, people's understanding and what we're making available to people so they could understand better. I say the church has an opportunity today during this issue with the pandemic and the race issues to go to work. We can go to work and do the things that they want us to do. We can't sit on the sidelines any longer and say that we don't know. There's too many books and too many sources of information that could bring us along and put us in a better place. Richard Allen, who's a former slave, and some of you may know of him. He was an African-American man. He started the African Methodist Episcopal Church 300 years ago. And he said something very profound. He said that freedom is not equality. Freedom is not equality, because one of the arguments you get from people is, we had the Civil War, they fought the war, and now you guys are free. But that doesn't mean there's equality in the things that I just talked about: housing, healthcare, jobs, incarceration, and those other issues. I know I've rambled a lot, but I'd like to close with a comment that I think is important. The comment is that I'm confident that this coronavirus is going to be cured. There's going to be a vaccine. There's going to be a pill that's going to be designed, and it's going to knock this thing away, and it's going to disappear. But I assure you, there will not be a vaccine or pill that will end hate, bigotry, and racism. That is just something that we're going to have to work very, very hard to fix. And we're going to have to share it with our kids and help them to understand that there's a lot of people's stories out there that need to be told. They need to be understood, and they need to be shared. So that's all I have. But I do ask the question, and I know that we're different religions, but I ask the question, what can we do? What can we do differently to come together? I do work with the AJC up in Cleveland. Lisi Shapiro's actually a real friend. And every time we get together, we talk about things like this, on how we can do a better job of coming together, getting to know the best of one another, and changing the paradigm of the world that we live in today. Amen? Rabbi?
Amen. I thank you so much for speaking with us, and for telling us both about your personal experiences growing up, and also the experiences of the African American community, and the challenges that you laid out. That you left us with a question that we will, as a community, be grappling with. What can we do?
What can we do?
That is the charge that lies before us. And I know that this event tonight and this program and your talk will be a springboard for discussions for where we go from here. Because this is our obligation, both as citizens of our nation, and also as Jews, to think about how we ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect, and afforded all of the things that they need to thrive in society. And to really think about thank you so much for giving us things to think about in terms of how we got to where we are today. And I believe and I hope it's the first step in moving us to where we have to be.
Thank you. I enjoy doing this. This is fun. This is fun stuff. Every opportunity to bring people together is what we're really paid to do.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to log off now. It was wonderful to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And hopefully, Reverend Miller, I look forward after the pandemic is over to getting being able to bring us all together in person sometime.
Well, I'm going to email you my Zoom channel so you could tune in on Sunday.
Okay, sounds good.
Got it. Take care.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.